Hello, I'm Dr. Paul Rose, and in this short presentation I'm going to talk about the last of Tinbergen's 4 questions, the evolution question, which was one of his ultimate questions. And I'm going to talk about the evolution question using parental care as my example behaviour. And I'm going to look at a range of species and how they invest in their youngsters and why this strategy has evolved. Let's start off by looking at some ducklings. These are newly hatched Mandarin ducklings, and you can see that their eyes are open, they're covered in a thick layer of protective down, and they're perfectly capable of looking after themselves for the most part. They still need their mother for warmth and protection from the elements, but they are able to feed themselves, they can drink from themselves, and they can forage naturally in a very similar fashion to the adults. This is an example of a species that has precocial youngsters. Precocial youngsters are those that from birth or hatching are able to look after themselves pretty much from the word go. Consequently, there is limited parental care in the newborn. This strategy works very well when you can lead your youngsters to food, when you only need to make sure they're kept safe and secure at particular times of the day. It cannot be employed by all different species because of the range of habitats that species exist in. For things like Mandarin ducks that can take their offspring to water, which is a relatively safe environment away from predators, having precocial youngsters works for that species. It has evolved as the most adaptive strategy to ensure that that population of that species is sustainable and can be viable into the future. These mandarins hatched in my back garden. The female mandarin sat on these eggs for 30 days. That's a relatively long incubation period. A lot of her work is done to develop the embryo within the egg in the nest, so that when the youngster hatches, it can be relatively independent and has full mobility. This is a different strategy to other birds, as we'll come to in a minute. Interestingly for a duck, mandarins nest in tree hollows, and consequently their ducklings hatch many meters off the ground. Therefore the ducklings have to employ a range of climbing and jumping behaviours to get themselves out of their nesting cavity, and I will explain a bit about these behaviours later on. Whilst these ducklings are precocial, they share this tree nesting habit with other species of birds that you might be more familiar with. These are some juvenile starlings. They also nest in tree hollows and cavities, or in nest boxes. Unlike the Mandarin ducklings, starling chicks are not precocial. They're what we call altricial. When they hatch, blind and naked, they cannot thermoregulate and they cannot feed themselves. Consequently, they remain within the nest for a much longer period of time, and they are very much dependent on their parents for all of their daily needs to keep them alive. These are starling chicks in their nests. You might be familiar with other types of garden bird, such as these blue tits, which have a very similar nesting strategy. And in some mammals too. This, believe it or not, is a nest of rabbit kits, altricial, the same as the blue tits and the starlings. And you can see these baby rabbits are kept warm by the thick layer of fur that's lining the nest their mother has made for them. This is exactly the same as we see in the bird's nest. Let's go back to the starling chicks. A thick layer of feathers is used for insulation. You can see in these altricial chicks, their mouths have a bright yellow lining. This is called a gape. The gape is very important. It tells the parent birds to constantly supply their youngsters with food. Here, in these two near to fledging chicks, still in their nesting hole, the parent is instinctively providing them with food because of this bright yellow gape. This feeding behaviour of the parent birds to this begging chick is called a fixed action pattern. And you can see in these videos, youngsters employ a range of vocalizations and wing fluttering behaviours to encourage this fixed action pattern. In some species, this behaviour can be taken advantage of. This is a cuckoo chick. You can see the bright orange and yellow gape being fed by a totally unrelated species, a reed warbler. This is an example of brood parasitism. The fixed action pattern, which compels the reed warblers to feed a begging chick, has been hijacked by the cuckoos, who have no parental care of their own offspring. The cuckoo abandons its parental care to the reed warbler. These examples of the starlings and of the Mandarin ducklings show you these two different strategies that are employed by birds and other animals in the raising of their youngsters. The precocial chicks take a lot longer incubation time. They spend a longer time developing in the egg. The altricial chicks have a shorter incubation, but they require much more parental investment after hatching. The mandarin will sit on her eggs for about 30 days, the starling for about 2 weeks. Consequently, it is a different strategy employed by these species. Let's take a look at a close relative of the mandarin. These are North American wood ducks. These are well-grown ducklings that are fending for themselves. Unlike the starling youngsters, which you have seen as fledged juveniles, these juvenile wood ducks are able to feed and forage for themselves, completely independently of their parents. In fact, in this video, you can see the mother wood duck in the background foraging for her own food without a care in the world as to what her youngsters are up to. Both wood ducks and mandarins nest in tree holes. Here is a female mandarin with her brood. These ducklings are about to leave the nest, and they are jumping out of the tree hollow to the ground below. To enable this behaviour to happen, the ducklings have to be precocial. They have to be led away from the nesting area by their mother to safe areas for feeding and foraging. Because she cannot bring food to them, because she is a single parent family, she cannot have altricial youngsters. So these different types of parental care investment depend very much on the species' reproductive strategy and its habitat. The water-based feeding and foraging areas that ducklings use are relatively safe, and consequently their youngsters can be precocial. And when these youngsters reach near adulthood, let's go back to the wood ducks. Here you can see a video of the same juveniles that were foraging on the ground. These are them now foraging in water, employing the same feeding and foraging behaviours that you would see in the adult birds. Consequently, the parental care strategy is based upon a range of evolutionary factors that allows that species to be as successful as possible within the environment that it has evolved to live in. And that strategy enables the species to rear as many of the youngsters as possible to sexual maturity so that those youngsters can breed themselves. Even in species that all produce precocial youngsters, we see different levels of parental investment. Here we have a female mallard with her ducklings, the same strategy as we see with the wood duck and the mandarin. And here we also have a family of greylags, a species of goose, with their goslings. The female mallard is a single parent family. She relies on the highest number of fertile eggs hatching as possible in the hope that she swamps her predators with enough tasty treats, which unfortunately ducklings are, so some of them survive. The greylags produce fewer youngsters and lay fewer eggs, because both parents are invested in the survival of their youngsters. Both help rear the goslings, and both defend them from predators. You may be familiar with this level of parental care. Here are a pair of mute swans defending their cygnets, well known in the animal kingdom for being excellent parents. And here we have a completely opposite example to everything that I've explained so far. This is an Australian brush turkey. It is moving stones and mud, soil and dirt and leaves behind it to push together into a big mound. Within that nest mound, it lays its egg. It relies on the heat generated from the rotting vegetation within that mound to incubate the egg. The egg laid by the brush turkey is incredibly large. It provides a lot of nutrients for the developing chick. And this is incredibly important because brush turkeys do not look after their youngster when it hatches. In fact, the chick is so well developed at hatching that it is able to defend and fend for itself as soon as it leaves the nest mound. This is a totally different strategy employed by the brush turkey compared to the mandarins, the wood ducks, the geese, the swans, and even the starlings with their altricial youngsters. But this strategy only works for the brush turkey because it lives in a rainforest where there is a lot of vegetation around, a high temperature and a high humidity to hatch its egg. What about if you share your parental care with someone else? Let's look at another species that produces precocial youngsters. In this video you can see two pairs of common shell duck. Both have ducklings. Shell duck will sometimes form large groups of ducklings together under the care of one set of parents. This is called creshing, where multiple ducklings from multiple families will be looked after by one set of parents. This is an unusual behaviour, and we don't really know the explanations for it. But in this photo, you can see an example of a large shell duck creche. These huge broods of ducklings may enhance the survival of some of the youngsters as they get to adulthood, although there are studies that say that creshing can be counterproductive to duckling survival. Either way, it shows an example of the weird and wonderful ways that species have evolved to invest in their youngsters based on the strategies employed, are they altricial or are they precocial, and the level of parental care that is needed to keep them safe and well to ensure that they can grow up and breed for themselves in the future.